Hi everyone. So today, just like with the object analysis paper that we've now all hopefully completed and gotten back graded, I want to go over expectations and how to find some sources for your source analysis paper, your written source analysis paper, also known as the final paper for this course. I'm going to share a few links to various databases and library collections of primary sources, as well as talk to you about the assignment itself and the expectations that I have for this assignment, and talk a little bit about what a primary source is and why they're important. Yeah, so this will be a pretty quick one, maybe about 20 minutes. No reading assigned for today. You do have your weekly discussion to work through, and I do want you to keep up with the textbook, but I've left today open as a reading day for you so that instead of looking at the textbook, you can go ahead and start to think about what kinds of sources you might want to use for this paper. Okay, so to start with here, one example of a primary source, and we'll get into what a primary source is in a minute. Here we have the Papyrus of Ani, or Ani. I'm not sure the pronunciation here of this ancient Egyptian name, from the Book of the Dead, or it's synonymous with the Book of the Dead. This is a source from roughly 1250 BCE. This is a very old written source, originally written in Egyptian hieroglyphics, but translated into English. And for the purposes of this course, the primary sources I want you to look at are generally going to be ones that are translated into English. If you read another language and you want to read them in another language, like Spanish or Chinese or something, that is fine with me. You still have to show me where you got this source and provide a link to it in your paper, provide a full citation to it, but it's okay to use sources in other languages if you prefer. The Papyrus of Ani, for example, we have a full translation of it here on a nice, reputable online website, digital source from the University of Pennsylvania, the African Studies Center. And I can tell this is a good site, number one, because of the URL. I can see it's from an edu, from UPenn edu. And if I want to verify that, I could just go to upenn.edu and see who it is. And also, when I go down to the very bottom, I have some reference information. So while this is quite an old internet source, once again, Kevin with his old websites, this one from 1994, we can see who wrote it, who edited it, and it is linked to an academic institution, and you can look up these people if you want to find out about who is doing this translation. We have here at the top, the translation is by E.A. Wallace Budge, whoever that is. And if this is the source you are using, you should look up who that is. That's part of your job, is to look up, okay, search Google for E.A. Wallace Budge. Let's find out about him. Okay, I'm going to cheat and use Wikipedia for a second here. Okay, great. He's an Egyptologist. He's well known. He worked at the British Museum, etc. This guy is a legitimate source. He's a very old source, but this is a very old piece of writing. That's totally fine. So this is one example of a web source that, even though it looks kind of, I don't know, it's a little bit of an old website, it's a perfectly valid source to use. And I want you to use this kind of source, not something like Wikipedia in this class. Once again, don't use Wikipedia, don't use people's blogs. We've kind of been over this. Make sure you're using a reputable source for all of the material you use in this class. Okay, so let's dive into this. Try to keep this as short as we can. The assignment itself, taken directly from your syllabus, the master document that you should be consulting whenever you have questions about the class. Before you email me, look on the syllabus. About half of your emails, I would say, are things that are covered in the syllabus. When you ask me a question, look at the syllabus first, okay? The source analysis is worth 25% of your grade, so this is a pretty big chunk. You should take this assignment pretty seriously. You're going to examine one or more written sources, meaning primary sources, from the pre-modern world. The rough deadline for this course being 1500. If you find a source from like 1580 and it's really your dream source that you want to work on, that's probably fine. Just shoot me an email and say, hey, I want to work with this source. Is that cool? And I'll say, yeah, that's fine. If you're working with sources from like 1800, that's too late for this course. That's a modern source that doesn't work for the period of time we're studying. It doesn't fit into the context of any of the stuff we've been talking about this term. So try to keep it to before 1500. There's a little bit of flexibility there. If you absolutely need to get a source that's 1540, 1560, something like that, we can make that work. You should form an argument using the source that relies on its significance as a representation of a particular time, place, or people. So as I will say later in this mini lecture, this is not a book report. You're not just telling me what's in the source. You're telling me why the source is important and why what it's saying is important. We'll get back to that in a little while. This paper should be between 4 and 5 full pages in length. So 4 full pages means it goes to the very end of the 4th page, not that it just has 1 line on the 4th page. That is not a page. And it should include citations for both the primary source that you're using and at least 1 additional secondary source beyond the textbook. So you can still use the textbook, that's fine. It can be one of your secondary sources. You need to have at least 1 more that comes from somewhere else. We'll talk about that in a second. And once again, no Wikipedia, please. Do not use Wikipedia. To boil this down to a really simple format here at the bottom, you need 1 or more primary sources. You need 1 or more secondary sources. This means things like journal articles, which I helped you find earlier in the term for the object analysis paper. You can go back and rewatch that video if you need help with finding journal articles. Books, academic books, some of which may be found on things like Google Books, or our library website has some books that are available digitally, or high quality web sources, ones with citations, ones that are using other sources to prove their points. Academic websites, not people's blogs, not newspaper websites, not the New York Times. I don't want that. I want something more in depth and a good quality secondary source, 10 to 15 to 20 pages in length if you were to print it out. These are significant sources. I'm not saying you're going to read every word of those sources, but that's the quality and length of a secondary source that you would want to use to back up your information from the primary source. Once again, 4 to 5 pages, not 3 pages and 1 line on the 4th page. It's the most obvious thing students do is to kind of make their papers appear longer by putting a bunch of junk at the very top of their first page and then bumping that extra line onto the next page to create their magical 4th page with 10 words on it. That is not a 4th page. Don't do that. It's the most transparent thing ever. I'd rather you just had 3 pages than 3 pages and 1 line on a 4th page, because at least you're not insulting my intelligence in that case. Formatting and citations should be just like those from the object paper. You can see those in our sample paper once again. That is still online in our documents folder. So there's already a well-formatted, properly cited paper for you to look at. And once again, I don't care if you use Chicago, MLA, whatever you'd like. I personally prefer footnotes. As I said last time, if you need to use in-text because that's what you're familiar with, that's what you're comfortable with, we'll deal with it. That's okay. I personally think it looks a little bit messy and is a little bit harder to read, but whatever you're comfortable with is fine with me. And let's talk about for a minute, what is a good primary source? And I've stolen a list here from this website from the American University in Washington, D.C. And here's their list of primary sources. I've highlighted in orange the ones that are really applicable for us, because some of these don't exist before 1500, right? You could use diaries, letters, speeches, autobiographies. Obviously, we don't have photographs. You could use official records like government reports, transcripts, court records, death certificates. These all exist in the pre-modern world. This list of things here, not really so good either because they don't exist or because they're not like a text source. For example, there are lots of maps and charts and things, and there is music in the pre-modern world, but I want you to use a written source for this paper. Maps and charts I would kind of put under our object study, or more of a visual object study. We've kind of done that already, and now I want you to dig into some text. Laws, statutes, and hearings are also excellent. The study of pre-modern law, I think, tells you a lot about societies. can be a little bit dry, but some of that can be really great. You could think all the way back to Hammurabi's Code, for example, which we did back when the class was in person, and how much that told us about the society that it was describing, 5,000 years ago or so, 4,500 years ago or so. And in this paper, I'm asking you to look at one or more written primary sources. So keep that in mind, they should be written. And the objects that we looked at previously, those were primary sources too, but we're moving on to a written source this time. Here's an example of a written source from a long time ago that I would look at in Japan. This is actually from one of the families that I studied from around 1200, but we won't get into it. We won't worry about what that actually says. A primary source is generally something from the time it's describing, directly describing the world around it, the time and place that it is from. It is not like a newspaper article. In this class, for example, would never apply because newspapers didn't exist before 1500. Later on in history, say if you're doing a modern history course, a newspaper could be a primary or a secondary source, because if you're studying the history of newspapers, then that's a primary source. But if you're studying the history of the thing that newspaper article is describing, like the crash of a train or something, then that train derailment would not be understood primarily from that newspaper article, which is simply describing it in secondary terms. If enough time had gone by, it could be the opposite though. So anyway, these things get more and more fuzzy the more and more modern you get, but for us, it's pretty obvious what a primary source is. It's something from the time that you're studying. My advice to you in getting going on a topic is to find a source first, kind of figure out maybe where you want to study, maybe when you want to study, and then see if you can find a source, then build your topic around that. So if you want to study ancient Egypt, for example, you might find this papyrus of Ani first, and then read what's in it, and then figure out what you actually want to write about in the paper. You know you want to write about Old Egypt, but maybe not like, I want to write about trade in Old Egypt, because maybe you can't find a source for that. You might want to just read what this is about and then say, okay, here's an argument I could make about Old Egypt now that I have this source. It's a fact of life in studying history that finding a primary source you want to work with can be difficult. It's probably half of the time that we spend as historians is finding and reading and understanding our sources. It depends on the discipline, it depends on the time period and the place, but probably about half of our time is just spent figuring out and finding sources, maybe more than half in some cases. For me, for example, for someone who's reading old Japanese, I have to be able to read these documents, and that takes a whole bunch of time because I'm not even a native Japanese speaker, and this is not even a current kind of Japanese that I'm reading. It's an old Japanese that no longer exists. For me, it might be more like 70 or 80% of my time is spent finding and reading my sources. So you should spend a lot of time looking for and figuring out the sources you want to read, and then also reading them and trying to understand them as much as possible. As I said, many primary sources are not going to specifically address the topic you might want to cover. You have to get creative here as well. It's very important to be able to kind of understand how to make an argument, even if you have support that kind of only tangentially relates to your topic. You might be able to pull something out from an old source that will help you talk about, say, women's rights in medieval Japan, women's access to property, from a bunch of wills, bequests, and legal decisions about who got what property in a family. You might then be able to say something about women's rights in medieval Japan as it relates to property, for example. This is something I do. Even though there isn't a source out there that specifically says, these are the rights that women have in our society with regards to access to property, that source might not exist. You kind of have to find a way to get to the sources and get to the topics you want to cover. And this is the creativity and challenge of being a historian, making an argument. And there is a lot of craftsmanship behind this. You might look for, and I will talk a little bit about this in a minute because we have some excellent news related to the COVID shutdown and getting access to textbooks online. You might look for source books like this. They're kind of like textbooks, but they deal with sources a lot. Here's one, Medicine and Healing in the Pre-Modern West. I think it's a very interesting image here and a very interesting potential source here. Some of these could be hard to find, hard to get a hold of because the libraries are mostly closed right now, or have been closed for most of this term. But there are some interesting online ways to get at some of these books now that are currently free. We'll get to that towards the end here. I've already shared with you some lists of sources in the last few lectures. Here I'm copying these slides back in again. From Christian and Medieval Europe, here are a few lists, and you can look at these individually on your own. You can see there's quite a few of them. Also from Asia, I gave you quite a few. Once again, one of the best ones, which covers all places and times pretty evenly, as much as sources allow, is Fordham University. Their history source books, you can look here at the top and look at all the other ones. We have a global, Indian, Islamic, Jewish, lesbian and gay, science, women's, African, ancient, medieval, modern, Byzantine studies page. So for ours, we probably look mostly at ancient and medieval. Modern is not going to help us. And some of these topics will be kind of more limited to more modern sources. I would say probably the lesbian and gay section here and the science section here will have less from before 1500. This is just the reality of what sources exist. But you might also still find some if this is something you're interested in. You might still find some old sources on science or on sexuality from a long time ago. And I've had students study these things from a long time ago in the past, and it has worked out. So I can work with you if you're having trouble finding a topic and a source. Just make sure that you've actually tried first before you start emailing me like, Kevin, I don't know what to study. Don't send me that email. Send me an email like, Kevin, I really want to study the history of lesbian and gay people in ancient Greece or something like that. How can I get to that? And I will say, well, I don't really know, but here I'll try to help you because I'm a Japan scholar. I'll see if there's anything I can find. But make sure you do some of the legwork first before you start emailing me for help. Once again, look at all of these on the Fordham website. I think they're quite good. And then all these other ones I've given you are quite good. And I have a few more. These are new ones for today. Here's some kind of around the globe primary sources. Sources from the Islamic Empire, Indian history. Here again we have Fordham. Pre-modern Korean sources. This is a good one. This is Harvard's Gateway to Pre-Modern Korean Studies. The collected works of Korean Buddhism, veritable records of the Choson dynasty. So if you're interested in Korea, you can get some there. Primary sources in history and the classics from 600 to 1500, a perfect time period for this course. And you just kind of look through all of these. You might find some of them are better than others. Some of these links might be dead some of the time. The reality is that some of these links might not always function. Let's see, what else do we have? Classics, primary sources from Brooklyn College, Internet Ancient History source book. You're going to see some linking back to each other. So this is just linking to Fordham. The Duke Papyrus Archive. What an interesting one. I would love to sit here and look at this for an hour, but I'm recording this video, so I won't. Egyptian hieroglyphics. If you're interested in this, we have quite a few online documents. Okay, some of these will be harder to access for you, harder to penetrate in terms of maybe they're not written in English than others. Once again, just choose the path of least resistance, work in English or another language that you're fluent in. Don't worry about trying to translate from ancient Egyptian to English. Okay, don't do that in this course. We're not there yet. This is an introductory course. Greece, ancient and classical. Here we go, some excellent sources. Leo Bolus, the ultimate source for easy access to classical Greek and Latin texts. And I looked at this just a little bit earlier. You can see here all of these sources from ancient Greece. Wonderful. And you click on one of them, and some of it's from books. Perfect. Excellent. We now have a book, an entire book that has selected chunks of the classics. And these are the epigrams of Martial. These are, wonderful primary sources, which are in part in English, in part in Latin, but you can just work from the English section. And it appears here that they have the Latin and then the English on one page and then the next page. Perfect. Excellent. Chinese poetry from the classics. This is a fairly old website, but it's here. It's on a legitimate edu URL, and you can look at some of these old pieces of Chinese poetry if you're interested. Okay. Here's another lifeline. So now that I've shown you all of those, I do encourage you to look at some of those. There's another really great thing that has become free because of the shutdown, because of COVID-19 coming and closing schools across the country. Red Shelf, which is an ebook, e-textbook rental site and seller of textbooks online, they're currently running free e-textbooks through May 25th. So this isn't going to last the whole term here for us, but through May 25th, you can get at some of these free ebooks. And I went ahead and registered with them. And you register, you just create an account, you just put your CUNY email here, put your name and all that, and it works just fine. I've tested it. And here are some of the things that I found. When I searched for medieval primary sources, I got 61 books, not all of which are ideal for us or perfect for us, but quite a few of them are. You have this Understanding Medieval Primary Sources. It's going to have lots of primary sources within it. Medieval Britain, Jews in Medieval England, Portraits of Medieval Eastern Europe, an area that we haven't studied enough in this course, both because the sources are harder to parse and because I am even less of an expert in Eastern Europe than in Western Europe. Sexuality in Medieval Europe. Muslims in Medieval Italy. What an interesting idea. What an interesting topic. You could look at the, collision of cultures there. The medieval church, violence in medieval Europe, for those of you interested in military history. I know there's at least a few of you who are into that. Crisis of medieval Russia. And I think you get to check out 5 or 6 of these books at once from Red Shelf that you can then look at. I don't know how long those checkouts last or how easy it is to kind of swap them in and out. So look at them and borrowing them, kind of cautiously, don't just grab the first 3 that look interesting to you. Make sure one looks interesting and viable for you. Let's go ahead and go through this process. Let's see how difficult this process is. So I just click Add to My Shelf. If I want Introduction to Medieval Europe from 300 to 1500, 2nd edition. This looks great. It looks like a book I could use. Let's add it to my shelf. And here we go. I get it for 53 more days. I can start reading it. And hopefully my internet is fast. And boom, we have this. So we have this book now that I can now look at all I want and flip through. And there will be some primary sources in here. So this is a very good way to get primary sources if you just kind of want to use one of these textbooks. It might not mean that things are tailored specifically to your interests, but I found a lot of these books. The Chinese Language and European Texts, Knowledge and Power, Science and World History, The Renaissance of Letters. You can kind of pause the video if one of these is interesting to you. The Silk Road, A New History with Documents. Oh boy, I want to add that one to my shelf. I'm going to look at this one myself later. Because this is something that maybe I could use on my own. But coverage and the Mongols and Marco Polo, oh, what an excellent potential source, as long as the primary sources are pretty significant here. I've even heard of the author. I don't remember anything about her, but I've heard her name, Valerie Hansen. And here we go. So we have the Kingdom of Daqin, Fan Ye, 445 CE. These are all documents. Pliny the Elder on the Country of Ceres and the Silkworm, Natural History from 77 CE. This is excellent. So we have some wonderful documents, and you have documents for each chapter here. You could use some of these as your primary sources. Maybe use a couple of these because they're pretty short. Might be a good idea. Going through here a little bit more. Knowledge and Power, Science and World History, 2nd edition. Sources of Western Society since 1300, the 11th edition. Understanding Medieval Primary Sources, we saw that a minute ago. Zhuangzi, so if you're interested in, Zhuangzi from maybe 4 or 5 lectures ago from Chinese philosophy, actually more than that, maybe 6 or 7 lectures ago, understanding Taoist philosophy, Zhuangzi is a really good one to look at. Medieval Britain, Jews in Medieval England, we saw that a minute ago. Portraits of Medieval Eastern Europe, 900 to 1400, that's a perfect timeline for us. And most of these, because I searched for primary sources, they're going to have them. So by using primary sources to construct the lives of and give a voice to the types of people, blah, blah, blah. So primary sources are going to be in this book. I know that already. Medieval Church, violence in medieval Europe, which we saw earlier. Women in early medieval China. Samurai warfare in the state in early medieval Japan. I can recommend this, personally. I've read this entire book several times. This is Carl Friday, who I mentioned in one of our Japan lectures. I think it was the last one from just last week. Introduction to Medieval Europe, the one that's on my shelf already now. Early medieval Ireland. Partnership and profit in medieval Islam. Anna Komnene, I'm not sure how you say this. Another wonderful source about the Byzantine princess. And, this is all just about one person, the life and work of a medieval historian. Very interesting. Ancient Rome, A New History. So this red shelf opportunity that we have to use their website to get free books, all this is free. I didn't pay anything to get any of these. And you can get 5 or 6 of them at a time. Is definitely a good and pretty easy way to get at some primary sources. I do recommend that you look at some of those others that I showed you earlier, but I just found out about this one pretty recently here, and I think this is a good way to access some primary sources. Okay, so let's say you found a source, or maybe a couple of primary sources if they're short ones from those textbooks. What do you do now? What's next? Your job is to prove a point about a place and time based on one or more primary sources. Here are some questions, for example, that I just kind of thought up in my head based around primary sources that I do know exist. You could say something like, was warfare in medieval Europe critical to the improvement of medicine? And then you prove it, yes or no. Probably, most of these, the answer is probably yes, right? Was the Islamic Empire a key source of mathematical knowledge for the outside world? Prove it. Use a source. Prove it. Was Christianity modified based on where and when it was practiced? Yeah, prove it. So use your source to prove it. And what not to do, as I mentioned earlier, is don't just say, here's my paper. This is my source. This is what it says. The end. That's a book report. I don't want a book report. So you need to make an argument. You need to say, this source says X, Y, Z about this place and time, and this is important because. So you need to both answer the why is the source important and why is this topic important question in your paper. You can do that quite directly, like I said with the object study paper if you want to. If you just want to say, this is vital to understanding the history of medieval Islam because X, Y, Z. That is a perfectly fine statement to put either in your introduction or your conclusion or both. Both is probably a good idea. You need to definitely focus on making that argument clear. So every good historian writing a good piece of history is actually making a pretty clear argument about something. And so you need to find that something for your paper. Okay? So I've given you a lot of resources here. Hopefully they're helpful. Red Shelf looks excellent. A lot of those lists or databases of primary sources, especially the one from Fordham, are quite good. And I recommend that you spend a good chunk of time, spend a few hours looking for your primary source. Put a couple of hours into it, and it'll make writing your paper easier if you find a source that's really good, that you connect with, that kind of makes you feel like making an argument about it. For next time, we have our student-led discussion coming up, which you should be working on now. We have our lecture next week on Mongolia and the Mongolian Empire and the Mongols, and also our next student-led discussion on the Mongols and the Silk Road. All right, that's it for this week. I hope this has been very helpful. I might go ahead and put this lecture up out of order. I'm thinking about putting it up early or as early as possible because I want to give you lots of time to work on this. But please let me know if you have questions about primary sources, but do be sure to at least do some searching around first before you start emailing me, okay? All right, thanks everyone, and I will see you next week.